Hi. I was recently invited to perform at a local synth show. I said I'd do it if they set up a quadraphonic system, and they did, so here we are. In this video, I'll share with you a few general tips and ideas I learned along the way, regardless of the instrument you use, and also specifically why I chose Ableton Live and Push for this show. I'll walk you through why I picked this selection of instruments, including my invisible air drum set. And then if you're interested in quad or 360 performances, a few tips and ideas for spatial audio. Before I start, a quick disclosure. Some of the gear you'll see here was either provided at no cost or significantly less than retail, but no company has any say over the content of this video. This channel is funded mainly by my Patreon, where you'll find all the tips in this video and much more. Okay, let's get started. Before I talk about the gear, there are two general principles that guided me in creating this setup. First, I don't know about you, but for me, I can play and perform in front of a crowd, but as far as remembering things like the tempo of a track or to unarm tracks after I'm done using them, let's just say I've learned not to trust myself to remember things during a show the hard way. So in everything I do and set up, the technical stuff needs to sort itself out as much as possible, and things need to be arranged in a way where it's pretty clear what needs to happen next just by looking at the setup so that I can focus on playing and not thinking. And then the second principle that guided me was that to the extent possible, I should actually be playing music live as opposed to just launching clips or scenes. Obviously, as one person playing, I can't perform every single note live, but I think that whenever possible, the most prominent element of what's going on musically should be performed live. To me, that means playing live on keys or on the dual temperas here, or since I'm not a good finger drummer, using my air drums, which I'll explain. And in many cases, I programmed chord progressions into scenes so that each scene that I launch isn't necessarily a chorus or verse, but rather a chord, and I can vary the order that I trigger the scenes to play a different progression as I go along. On the other hand, things that don't have an audible impact on what the audience hears when I do them, for example, whether the right tracks are armed or not, or the tempo and time signature of different scenes, those are things that hopefully should happen on their own. There's no benefit to the audience seeing you change time signatures unless you can be really expressive when you do it. In terms of guiding principles for the setup, here too my goal was to reduce complexity as much as possible and have as minimal a setup as I can. Before we get into technical tips, a quick tour of the setup and why I chose each element of it. The main brains of the setup is Push 3 in controller mode paired with my Mac. Each of my tracks was written on different gear, so it's not practical for me to bring all that along to perform. Also, while I love gear with plenty of knobs and hands-on controls, in a performance situation, I rarely need to change more than 8 parameters at a time per instrument, and with Push, I can condense those into one page. There are two reasons why I used Push in controller mode as opposed to standalone. First, my air drum machine needs Leap Motion drivers, the Gecko software, and the Beat Fader plugin. All three need a computer to run. And then second, I wanted to be free to choose to use any third-party plugins I want, not just Ableton ones. Now, I could have theoretically spent time to convert everything to stock Ableton plugins for use in standalone mode, but since I was going to have to use a computer anyway, I didn't spend time on that. The big con of using Push in controller mode is that you need to bring in a computer to the show as well. But the way I have things set up, the computer is just sitting on the side with its lid half down. I never missed it or its screen, and everything I need is controllable from Push. A word about Push 2 versus Push 3. Since I didn't use standalone mode or the MPE capabilities of Push 3, Push 2 would have done fine. However, if I needed to expand the setup more in terms of synths, the ADAT features of Push 3 would have come in handy, and I did end up using the USB Type A port for another port to my computer. Speaking of ADAT, the next important element of this setup is the audio interface. While Push 3 has inputs and outputs, it's nowhere near enough for what's needed for even this small setup. I chose the UCX2 from RME for 5 reasons. It is expensive though, so here's why I picked it. Your interface may be able to do some or all of these things. First, it has a screen that shows you level meters, so it's very easy to see what's going on at all times. There are no fixed level meters on Push. You need to go into the mixer settings, and even then you don't see everything. That's also why I have the interface at an angle, so that I can always see what's going on with a quick glance. If all 4 outputs aren't firing, it's not a quad show. Then the second reason I picked this interface is that it's relatively compact and portable considering the number of inputs and outputs it has. 4 inputs up front and 4 in the back, with plenty of outputs for sends. The third reason I picked it is because it has a built-in recorder, which records as many tracks as you like. So I was able to record the show in high quality without relying on the house system. I couldn't use Ableton Live itself to record because I start and stop transport a lot during the show. Now, if your audio interface doesn't include the option to record the set, but it does have a loopback function, you can always use some other DAW or Audacity to record your set. It just requires a bit of setup. The fourth thing to consider when selecting an interface is expandability. If its inputs and outputs aren't enough, the nice thing about this setup is that both the RME interface and Push 3 support ADAT, so I could easily expand one with the other if needed. If you do choose to do that, just be mindful of which is clock lead and which follows. You set that either in your interfaces settings or in Push. In the audio tab, you choose either internal clock source or ADAT. If you don't have an interface with ADAT and are still missing inputs, if your instruments have audio pass-throughs, you can connect external audio to them. For example, Tempera can pass in clean audio or apply its internal effects to external audio, and that can be fed back into the system. The fifth thing to consider is whether you can create different mixes for different outputs in the interface. In this case, I created one mix for the headphone output. So here I can monitor all 4 channels through this stereo pair, but the main outputs only take in 2 channels, and then for quad, these 2 each take just one of the 4 USB outputs. Then finally, for a quad setup, one of the most important things is to be able to have the main volume control more than just 2 channels. So for example, within Total Mix, you set that up by adding fader groups and then 1 fader controls, in this case, both the main outputs and outputs 3 and 4, all 4 levels together. And if the 4 speakers in the quad setup weren't identical, you can first set relative levels, then enable the fader group, and the master would then control all 4 relative to each other. The knob on the panel also controls this. Okay, let's move on and talk about which other synths, effects, and controllers you might want to add to a push-based setup. For me, if it's a sound or effect I can get close enough to in software, I don't need it physically with me in hardware form. To me, it's about what I can perform with. So for example, in a previous show, I used Moog's Siren because it sounds great, but also has meaningful performative sound design controls directly on the panel. For this show, I went with 2 Temperas. First, because even though Tempera is a digital synth, how it works and plays is just something you can't replicate in software without a controller, I guess, that looks like this. And then 2 of them make for a very special quadraphonic effect. Obviously, you can't hear it now because I'm folding everything down to stereo. But the 2 of them just sound so delicious in quad that you really have to be there. Hopefully one day you will. It's not just about smearing grains across more speakers. Since these are tempo synced, I set different tempo sync intervals on the different Temperas, so each speaker in the quad space is triggering different rhythmic tempo synced intervals, which sounds very special. The Temperas are MIDI synced, by the way, so a note triggered here also triggers on this one, but you can't see it on the panel, but each of them is doing its own tempo synced thing. So for example, here's the left one, and then this is the right one. So clock is synced and the notes are synced, but the settings themselves aren't, so I can bring in different emitters on each Tempera and fill up the quad space in very interesting ways. In terms of effects, it's the same deal for me. I only use external hardware if it's an effect that I don't have a software alternative for, or it's an effect that has a unique set of performative hands-on controls. In this case, Samarkanda is a quad delay, so it's a perfect fit for a quadraphonic show. It's got up to 15 seconds delay on each of its 4 channels. They could be set to reverse or hold. And they can be tempo synced or synced to each other as well. So could you set up 4 delays in software and set up a MIDI controller with all these knobs and buttons on it? Potentially, yes. As a performance instrument, this was a lot of fun for sure. And I have a send going into it, so I could send any track that I want into Samarkanda and create either a long, evolving, phased texture or a tempo sync delay. Then finally, to round out the setup, we've got these two, a Leap Motion controller and +3. +3 isn't here for self-promotion, or at least not just for that. One thing I think you'll find very useful is pairing push with another controller to control fixed parameters. On push, you're always moving around between different devices and these knobs control different things. I found it very useful to have faders or knobs or buttons that are fixed to specific parameters. For example, in this case, it's crunchy tape delays, where I can bring up feedback if I wanted, but also bring it down if things get too hectic and I don't need to race around menus looking for the control that I need for it. And then Leap Motion powers my air drum machine. I made a whole video about making music in thin air, so I won't repeat it here, but in a nutshell, Leap Motion detects my hand motion in multiple different directions. And then I use the Gecko software to translate that into MIDI CCs, in this case, in the up and down direction, and forward and back. These are fed into instances of Beat Fader. So basically I'm controlling this fader here. And then Beat Fader is sending MIDI out to these tracks, which have drum kits on them. And there are 2 of these, one for the up-down motion and the other for the back front. Okay, so that's the setup. The next tip or idea I found very useful for live performance is preparing the right macros or parameters you want to control so that you have immediate access to everything you need. This can be done on multiple levels. For example, in the first track of my set, I use the Tal Juno virtual synth. Even though it's relatively simple, it has quite a few parameters, and I certainly don't want to spend my time going in and paging through banks of parameters. Luckily, in Ableton Live, you can press Configure and move these around any way you like. I, of course, organized the first 8 that I want to be easily accessible. So they are right here, where I need them. Now, Configure works nicely for one instrument. If you want to control both the instrument and an effect or 2, you can group them into a rack and then create mappings for any parameters that you want immediate access to across the effects as well. You can also rename these if you want. And once you're done, you've got control both of the instrument and the effect. Now that's nice, but what if I wanted to control a parameter that's outside the track that I'm currently on? By default, Ableton Live doesn't allow that. However, there's a trick to overcome that limitation. If you've got a copy of Live Suite, if you add any Max for Live device that can be mapped to control external parameters, for example, the LFO, I could set its rate to 0 and then choose an offset and then use the offset parameter to control any other parameter I want. So let's say that I wanted to control drum levels from this track. I would just map the up-down drum levels here. So now we've got that controlled using the offset. So now if I go ahead and select with Shift and group these into an instrument rack and go ahead and quickly make some mappings. So now I've got control over the filter cutoff, drive, and drum levels from one place. Okay, let's zoom out and explore how to organize multiple songs or tracks for a live set. I've seen a few approaches for this. Some people prefer to organize a set in the arrangement view. That certainly works, especially if your songs have a fixed linear progression, but in my opinion, that goes against the whole point and power of Ableton Live's session view for performance and severely underutilizes Push, which has no view into the arrangement. For me, arrangement view for performance is a non-starter, but if that's the route you want to go, I saw quite a few tutorials on YouTube for people who prefer to work this way. Then another approach I saw was to use the same 8 tracks for all your songs. So say you pre-assign tracks by kick, other drums, bass, pads, theme 1, theme 2, vocals, and so on. And then you simply work your way down the session grid as your set progresses. There's an excellent video by Bohmer about that type of workflow. I'll link to that below. For me, that was actually too complex and required too much memorization or thinking. I wanted each song to be its own thing with its own track names, its own flow. I wanted to be able to grab songs from independent other projects outside of this live set and to easily drag and drop them into this set, which is something you can do in Ableton Live. So seeing as using the same 8 tracks for all my songs wasn't an option, the only other option is to work down diagonally. So this is, say, song 1 and its clips, and this is song 2 and its clips, and song 3 and its clips, and song 4 and its clips, and then another one and its clips. This easily lets me drag and drop tracks in from other projects. So all this is very nice, but this technique has a few cons. Let's see how we solve them. First, this creates a massively wide session grid. So one solution, which I did that anyway here, is to group the tracks per song. So this is song 1, and this is another, and this is another in groups, and another, and another. So I could do this and move from song to song to song to song and expand a song when I wanted to play it and close it down when I was done. So this way I'd only need to scroll up and down to find that song's clips. I decided not to go this route, but rather do something else. I'll expand all these. And I could do that on the computer, of course, as well. So rather, what I did was pad songs with additional tracks so that each song fits on 8 tracks. So here's another empty one, for example, another empty one, and I think the others weren't empty, but you get the idea. And I also padded the scenes so that they'd be grouped in groups of 8. And the reason I did all this is because when you press the layout button on push, you zoom out and see your entire set, then I could easily pick songs just by going diagonally down here. So this is song 1, song 2, song 3 and its clips, 4, and 5. It's almost as if this is my load set button. If I ever wanted to rearrange my set, by the way, I could simply drag and drop the entire group 8 tracks forwards or back. I would also need, though, to drag and drop the respective 8 scenes if I wanted to keep this nice diagonal layout where I would always find the clips for that song in order. Moving on into how I have the external synths and effects feeding into Live. They're just set up on tracks. So here, for example, for each of the 2 temperas, these tracks are set to monitor in, so they're always active, regardless of whether they're armed or not. So I'll always hear both temperas. Samarkanda was set up in a very similar way, with the slight difference. I put a gate device on each of its 2 tracks. This is designed for Eurorack levels. I had to crank levels way up, and there was just a little bit of noise coming in. Once I set the gate threshold very low, I could set these tracks to constantly monitor Samarkanda, and it would never introduce any noise into my main tracks, unless it was actually doing something. Moving on, Ableton Live is set to arm selected, so it's always arming the track that I select. One thing you should be aware of, though, if you want to arm more than one track, you can by holding record and then arming, say, 3 tracks. But in this case, if you select a different track, it won't unarm the previously armed tracks. So now for this song, I'm good to trigger my ARP and drums, but if I move to a different song and, say, arm a different track, the other ones are still armed. So you do one of 2 things. Either remember to unarm tracks when you leave a song. I don't recommend remembering stuff, or automate the disarming of tracks whenever you start a different scene. I'll show you how to do that in a bit. Next little trick I wanted to show you is how I use or don't use stop clips. So remember how I showed you earlier for this song, I've got a very long sample playing here, but these are basically chords in a song. So I don't want this to stop as I move between the different scenes. Of course, if I want the entire song to stop, I'll just press here. But I didn't want this loop to stop when I'm playing these scenes. And the way to do that is to remove the stop button when you don't need it. Here, obviously I do, so I'm going to keep it in, but there's no stop button for each of these 3 scenes. Next tip is how to end a song. So like I showed you earlier, you can use stop clips. You don't want to stop transport because that can sometimes sound bad, like that. So stop clips are preferred. Then another way, if you want the outro to be different, not just stop all the clips. So say for example, in this song, I've got this going on, and let's say that I just want to end the song now. Then if I press this row, these clips are set to play once with some automation of the sounds fading out. So whereas typically in an Ableton Live session grid, clips are set to loop, the ones in this last row aren't. Instead, they've got a fade out automation. Of course, if you wanted to transition to a different song, you could fade its clips in such a row, or use dummy clips to automate different parameters. Depends on how you want to transition from one song to the other. Then another little tip, if you're playing live and you want to play chromatically, that's great. But say in this song, I wanted to focus on the delay while I was just noodling with this piano. So I shamelessly put a scale device on this track so I can focus on playing with the delays and know that I'd never hit a wrong note here. And then the final tip before we head out to the quadraphonic /360 spatial segment of this video is to check out IFTA's performance pack for Ableton Live. It has a couple of arrangement view devices and 2 that are relevant across the board, one called Performer and another called Variations. I won't repeat his excellent tutorial here, but very briefly, the Performer device is a great way to create macros that control multiple parameters across different tracks in a set. For example, here I used one instance of it on the main track with just one parameter, but the reason that it was important was because this parameter is a macro that controls 2 delay lines across 2 different tracks, 2 different return tracks. And what's particularly important and useful with this device is that it doesn't only give you remote control, but also modulation control. Let me explain. So I control this parameter with +3's fader, but it in turn, rather than entirely take over the delay effect, in particular the intensity parameter of the delay effect, it modulates it in relation to a default setting that I set. So as you can see here, when I move the fader, it just moves this little dot as opposed to the entire parameter. I can then create an offset, and then my control will be in relation to that offset. That's particularly important here because I have 2 different base values for each of the 2 delays, and I didn't want to give them both the same value with remote control through here. Then there's the Variations device, which is similar to Ableton Live's rack variations, only this can apply to your entire set. This is similar to the snapshots feature in Machine, except that there's no support for morphs, and in a big set like this, it does sometimes take a second or so to adjust a lot of the parameters. You can use this to automate arms or mixer levels, device parameters, and sends, and you can launch these variations based on clip or scene names, or take temporary snapshots and then recall parameters after you went wild with them. I've seen it work well in smaller sets. In this set, it was a bit sluggish, so I did without it, but hopefully Ableton work on this and make it work quickly and seamlessly even for large sets. Okay, let's move on and talk about the quadraphonic or 360 or spatial aspects of this show and set. I think a good important question to ask is why even perform in quad? To me, the answer is that just like a good song will still be good coming from your phone's speaker in mono, but it's still going to be a richer and more enjoyable experience in stereo with proper speakers or headphones. The same applies to quad, but even more so since most people don't have a quad setup at home. As long as we're asking an audience to get off their couch and physically come to our show, we might as well give them an even more immersive, unique, and richer experience. So assuming we have a venue with 4 or more speakers, how can we actually manage that in a live performance? How do we get sounds to come from different places in space? assuming we don't want to just rely on two temperas. Even if you don't plan on fancy jet flyover effects, a good place to start is simply placing different instruments or tracks in your mix in different places in space. You can do that with any two stereo tracks. For example, with my drums, I send this track to 2 of the 4 speakers and this track to the other 2, and then I pan the different elements of the kit separately. So what we get in total is a quadraphonic drum kit. If you want to get even more fancy, there are spatial panners. Don Buchla invented this one in the 1970s, and you can get it for about $2,000 today. Luckily, we've got a few free and more affordable options on computers. For example, Ableton Live has the free surround panner device. It supports up to 8 speakers, and once you have that set up here, you can close this and just direct objects to anywhere you want in space. Here I've got an LFO rotating it, but I can just turn its rate down, and without modulation, you can just place this anywhere you want in horizontal space. Here I've got a clip with noise that's being sent to this panner. Let's get it going. And you can see it's over here. I can move it around in space. You're hearing this in stereo, but obviously on a quad setup, you'd hear it in quad. And I could change its focus, make it really small, or make it larger, and we'll hear it from more speakers. And of course, I can turn on my LFO, make it more focused, slow it down a bit, and we've got a storm. If you're playing at an even fancier venue with more speakers or speakers at different heights, then a nice free option is the Envelop Panner. It also has various delays and reverbs, and Ableton sells an advanced SPAT or SPAT pack. And there are various Dolby Atmos tools with panners that let you place objects anywhere you want in space, and then renderers that split that out to pretty much any speaker arrangement you can imagine. A bit more about how this set is set up. You'll notice that all my tracks are going to the sends only. I'm not using the main track because I've got my own 2 main tracks over here, these 2. I route all the audio to them, and I've got a simple compressor on them as well. So say, for example, my 2 temperas go directly to them, one to one pair and another to another pair. Then I've got 2 more sends with 2 reverbs on each. I don't recommend using a lot of reverb for swirling objects, but for objects that stay in the same place, it's useful. Even then, I don't think I used too much because I didn't want to smear the audio excessively. By the way, these 2 reverbs also don't go out directly to the speakers, rather they go to my main sends. So they're set to sends only as well. And you'll notice that on the return tracks, the sends by default are grayed out as opposed to the main tracks in the set. That's to avoid feedback. You need to enable sends by right-clicking and enabling a send. Then I've got 2 instances of tape delays. I went with Arturia's because I liked its crunch. This is a clear homage to the EFX3. I admit that I didn't bring it to the show because I didn't want it to get damaged, and it's not tempo synced, which these can be. I have these set differently for the front and rear speakers, and they've got ping pong enabled, so this is totally quadraphonic. I've got 2 surround panners here going in different directions. Depending on the track, sometimes I'll send hats to these, sometimes ARPs. The higher frequencies swirl better. And then Samarcanda gets its own return track here. It's a simple routing of audio to output number 5 on the interface so that I can send any instrument I want to it. And then the last tip for quad performance is to practice mixing, not just performing. So be ready to go back and forth between the mixer and whatever you're performing with to adjust levels in case, say, the hats or the snares are too low or too high mid-performance. You never know how the speaker system in the venue is going to surprise you, so be prepared to remix in real time. So that's it for this video. I'll post full Atmos versions of my set on streaming services that support it, and you'll find all these tips and many more on my Patreon in my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks. Hit like if this was useful, ring the YouTube bell below if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.